The government could soon be beaming a new message to us all. Get the government app on your smartphone.
Download the app.
For a foretaste, here's what Australia just launched.
It is important that you download the COVID Safe app. That is your ticket. That is Australia's ticket to a COVID Safe Australia.
The government says it's working 24 hours a day with some teams in different time zones to try to build a COVID-19 app, which it believes could play a critical role in getting the country out of shutdown and people back on the streets. But how will the app work? Could it spy on your movements? And why are so many other countries going for a different type of app? The app works on the basis of smartphones talking to each other, pinging Bluetooth messages from one smartphone to another when they're in close proximity. If I then tested positive for COVID-19 and surrendered the information from my phone to the authorities, others who'd come into close contact would get a message telling them to test or self-isolate.
The two tech titans are reworking their operating systems.
Marking the magnitude of the pandemic, the giant tech rivals Apple and Google have combined forces to offer a framework for individual governments' apps.
Contact tracing.
But here, the government is saying it wants to go its own way and do things differently.
So what's the difference between the two approaches? The Apple-Google approach stores most of the data about who you've bumped into on the phone. It's called the decentralised approach. The one being worked on by the government, known as the centralised approach, sends that data to a central server. And Apple and Google can bake their programs deep in the smartphone's operating system, allowing them to avoid security and battery issues. Apps that don't use the Apple-Google system may struggle to perform properly.
Die Regierung war bis jetzt für einen zentralen Server.
Over the weekend, the German government switched to the Apple-Google approach. It had been pursuing something more like the UK one.
Does Britain look a bit lonely now, not going down the Apple-Google path?
I think it does. The UK and now only in France are the kind of remaining backers of going their own way. And we have seen in other countries that tried this, that they did have technical issues with the apps as a result, and that could then cause, a flip down the line when they find out that the app that they were hoping was going to work doesn't work in the way that they want, and therefore that people aren't using it. And if people don't use it, it's not going to function, is it?
NHS, the unit in government running the app, says its approach will be quicker to roll out. The data in the central server, though anonymised, will help it track the disease more closely to correct errors and refine the product.
We really believe there are some profound benefits from being able to see the contact graph of not just the cascade running from phone to phone and user to user, but being able to see how it propagates more widely so you can detect patterns.
But could the app mutate into something like China's version? Compulsory, effectively a health ID card, without which you can't move freely. Some MPs worry about the involvement of the intelligence agency, GCHQ, in making it.
Well, I'm sorry to say that the Department of Health and GCHQ both have had a very clunky history when it comes to privacy. I mean, they've made a terrible mess of it from all sorts of reasons. The hard truth is they say that they think they can get more data out of a centralised system. Well, fine if it works. But the truth is that the NHS and the Department of Health have had IT problem after IT problem over the years. I can't actually think back to a system they designed that worked.
And we know that in countries around the world, these kind of tracing apps have evolved into immunity ID cards with the ability to travel to certain locations or not based on whether you've been given this ID card. And then there's enforcement action on the back of that, whether it's from the police or from other enforcement agencies. And we just want to make sure there's not mission creep as a consequence of acting at speed in understandable circumstances.
The government says you need 60% of the population using an app for it to be properly effective. And that could be a mighty challenge.
It will require us to have messages from everyone that people trust, both from the government and politics, but also more widely. It will require us to find messages and messengers that will resonate in the communities that all the communities of the country that we need to be part of this. It will require an enormous comms effort.
If we want to get back to sport, then we need to download the app.
When the time comes, you can expect British variations on the Australian government messaging.
Get back to business and back to enjoying life sooner.
Here, the government says its app will be ready for a local pilot within a week or so.
Gary Gibbon. Well, joining me now from Oxford is Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. And from Edinburgh, we have Lillian Edwards, Professor of Internet Law at Newcastle University. Lillian Edwards, what do you make of the government's decision to try and go with its own sort of centralised data collection app rather than the decentralised Google-Apple suggestion?
Well, I think they're aware of the issues that it raises, and it's often framed as a trade-off between the more privacy protective solution, which is the decentralized solution that Google and Apple have gone with, and collecting more data that might be useful for the epidemiology. But there are also quite impressive scientific evidence that the decentralized solution may work equally well. But what it may come down to is the fact that we were so slow off the blocks with mass testing, because it does seem like the decentralized solution works better if you start with a confirmed finding of positive coronavirus infection.
Nairi Woods, there are two issues here. One is, will it work? You know, will your phone run out of battery halfway through the day? And the second is the whole question of data. And will anybody care about data collection? Or will we just say, look, we've got to beat a disease, never mind the data question?
Well, I think that's a false choice. And the question of whether it works, as the NHS are saying, this will only help. It does not mean that you can do without manual contract tracing. You're still going to need every environmental contract tracer in the country. You're going to need an army of people actually going and having the conversations and doing the manual contact tracing. Question for Brits is, do we want to give up certain amounts of information in order to help speed up that contact tracing? And that itself won't work, as Lillian said, unless you've got full rapid testing and people have the chance and capacity to quarantine themselves when they're found to be positive. So it's not going to work on its own. We can see that already. And I do think with such an uncertain virus, it's really important that we learn from other countries and from what works in other countries much faster. It can't be that we try to invent every solution ourselves. So learning from the experience.
So which country do you think we should copy?
Well, I mean, South Korea's had the best results so far in managing the virus without a total lockdown. New Zealand is doing really well, although in both those, well, certainly in the New Zealand case, they started without too high an incidence of infection. People estimate that there's probably some 4% of the British population now infected. That's a huge task for public health. And there's no app, there's no giving up of your personal data that's going to solve that problem on its own. The real issue is, how can we let apps help? And how can lawyers like Lillian Edwards and colleagues put in place safeguards that mean that if we give up some liberty to fight this virus, we can take that back as soon as the virus has been fought?
Lillian Edwards, can you do that? Is it straightforward? Once you build a system that gathers all this data, can you just turn it off?
That's a technical question. I'm a lawyer, but it doesn't seem to me to be straightforward at all. We have a very long history of pandemics before this one, leading to impositions on autonomy and privacy. For example, passports were invented in the wake of a pandemic. What I've proposed, and what the Australians have actually passed into law, which really surprised me, came out on Sunday, is basically a Safeguards Act or bill, which would say things like no one should be compelled to install the app, no one should be compelled to share data from it, no one should be discriminated against because they choose not to do these things. And I think that's going to become a huge issue in the private employment sector, particularly. Are people going to be excluded from their workplace if they don't go with the contact tracing app, or perhaps later on with what might turn into an immunity certificate or immunity passport? And people have already hypothesized quite a lot that this would disproportionately impact on those who are the most vulnerable, the ethnic minorities, the people with no economic power, the people in 0 hours contract jobs, gig workers, etc. So there are all these kind of discriminatory problems that are wider than what people just think of as privacy, I think. And yeah, I do hope that legal safeguards could play a role there.
But if you take the South Korean example that Nari Woods mentioned, I mean, they just changed the law after their last experience, and there hasn't been a huge public outcry about privacy, despite concerns that there would be.
No, I think that's fair to say. And people have, again, hypothesized that places like Singapore and South Korea have had some background of authoritarian governments. They were more used to the government telling them what to do. They were less worried about their privacy. Who knows? These are probably overly simplistic. But what I'm saying is there's two different things going on here. One is the worry that a lack of privacy will impair public trust and confidence. And I think that is a big issue. We've seen in the past data breaches, we've seen care.data, we've seen a fuss about DeepMind. If we get another of these, Cambridge Analytica, then the public may lose faith in the app, which would be bad for public health, bad for all of us. So that's one point. But the other point is, how does the data and the app get used to perhaps exclude people from social good, from public services, from their workplaces? And in the future ongoing, if we do develop immunity certificates, immunity passports, then at that point, or before then, we're going to have a huge debate about how these are going to be used, because their purpose will be to discriminate.
I hope you'll both come back and join us for that debate too. Lillian Edwards and Nari Woods, thank you very much.